It's just before 7 a.m. on a Friday, January 19th, 2001. A freezing, bitter winter morning in Toronto. Inside the historic Gothic Revival building at 1 Spadina Crescent on the University of Toronto's campus, it's quiet. The students haven't arrived yet. The long, shadowy hallways of the Fine Arts Department echo only with the footsteps of a custodian making her early morning rounds. She makes her way down the corridor, stopping at the office of David Buller, a brilliant 50-year-old painting professor. He's a beloved mentor, an acclaimed artist, and a vibrant fixture in Toronto's queer community. She unlocks the door, expecting an empty office, a quiet office. Instead, she walks into a nightmare. Professor Buller is dead. He's been brutally stabbed multiple times in the chest and shoulder, his body left alone in the dark office. But the most chilling part isn't the violence of the crime scene, it's the timing. David Buller wasn't killed in the dead of night. He was murdered the previous afternoon, in broad daylight, while the building was bustling with students and faculty. The killer had walked right into his office, committed a frenzied, violent attack, and closed the door behind them, and then vanished completely unseen into the crowded campus. No murder weapon, no DNA, no witness. Welcome back to Homicidal Tendency. I'm your host, Matt, and I have a question. How does the killer pull off a brutal daytime assassination in a crowded university and leave no trace? But before we get into the case, I want to take a quick second to thank you all for tuning in. And even if it's your first time, I definitely appreciate all of my listeners. If you're enjoying the show, the absolute best way to support me and the show is to leave a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or the platform of your choice. Also, don't forget to come hang out with us on social media. We'll be posting all the photos of One Spadina Crescent and some of David's incredible artwork and other visual materials for the case. You can find us at Homicidal Tendency at most socials, and the only difference is we're at Homicidal Pod on Twitter/X. All right, housekeeping done. Let's get into the case. To understand the profound loss of David Buller, you have to understand the vibrant, unapologetic life he lived leading up to that terrible day in 2001. David was born in the 1950s. Think about that, what that means for the moment. Coming of age in the 1950s and 60s for a gay man, living an open, authentic life during that era that required an immense amount of courage. The world wasn't exactly rolling out the welcome mat for queer youth, let alone queer youth who wanted to make a living in the arts. Perhaps because of the societal pressures, David's first steps into the art world were actually geared towards more the conventional and the commercially viable path. In the early 70s, he enrolled in the advertising courses at Ontario College of Art, now known as OCAD. He was living the classic, gritty student life in Toronto. In fact, there's an incredible family story from the era that David used to love to tell. One day, his grandmother came to visit him at the cramped apartment he was sharing with other art students. She walked in, opened the refrigerator to see what he had been eating, and found absolutely nothing inside except a single jar of pickles. It was the ultimate starving artist moment, and David wore it like a badge of honor. He graduated from OCAD in 1973, but it didn't take long for him to realize that the commercial advertising life simply wasn't his soul's calling. He didn't want to sell products, he wanted to paint. He wanted to tell his own stories. So he made the bold decision to drop the commercial safety net and to pivot into entirely fine arts. David dedicated himself to mastering his craft. He spent the next decade refining his voice, eventually earning his Master's of Fine Arts from Concordia University in Montreal in 1985. Over the course of a 25-year career, his work evolved beautifully. He started with these massive, expansive abstract canvases, but as time went on, his art became deeply personal. He began creating pieces that proudly and openly explored his identity, his experiences, and his life as a gay man. For his family, especially his niece, Karen Sandalos, who would later become an art professor herself, David was a beacon. She has spoken beautifully about how seeing her uncle live his life so openly, it showed her exactly what it meant to be yourself and to pursue your passions without compromise. He modeled what it looked like to be completely unapologetically true to yourself. That lifelong dedication to his authentic self and his craft is exactly what led him to the University of Toronto. He wasn't just a teacher, he was a mentor who had lived through struggles his students were facing. He was finally where he was meant to be. Before we talk about the walls of one Spadina Crescent closing in on David that Thursday afternoon, we need to talk about the city outside those walls. Because you can't truly understand this case or how the investigation unfolded without understanding the world David was navigating. Toronto at the turn of the millennium was a city in transition. For the queer community, the Church and Wesley neighborhoods, affectionately known as the Village, was a vibrant, pulsing sanctuary. It was a place where artists, activists, and outcasts built a beautiful culture. If you've been listening to the show since the beginning, then the name of the gay village, it probably just sent chills down your spine. Because back in episodes 2 and 3, we did a deep dive into the terrifying reign of Bruce MacArthur. As we discussed, MacArthur also used the vibrant, trusting ecosystem of the exact same gay village as his personal hunting ground for years. While MacArthur's horrific crimes didn't happen until a decade after David Buller was killed, it's a dark, tragic through for this community. It's a chilling reminder that the very places built to be sanctuaries for queer people, places designed for connection, art, and safety, can sometimes be exploited by monsters hiding in plain sight. But, anyways, back to our story today. But as we all know too well, when looking at queer true crime, sanctuary doesn't always equal safety. The shadows of the infamous 1981 bathhouse raids still lingered in the collective memory of the community. There was an ever present underlying tension between the progressive, colorful life inside the village and the conservative realities of the broader world just a few streets over. David Buller lived right in the intersection of those two worlds. He was a respected academic in the historic halls of the university by day and a fixture of Toronto's gay scene by night. Let's take a closer look at what it really meant to be a gay man in Toronto in 2001 and why that context is absolutely crucial to the mystery of who walked into his office that day. To understand David Buller's world, you have to understand the profound paradox of what it meant to be gay in Toronto at the exact moment in history. On one hand, 2001 was a time of massive, groundbreaking progress. In fact, just 4 days before David was murdered, on January 14th, 2001, the first legal same sex marriages in the country were performed at the Metropolitan Community Church of Toronto. There was a palpable feeling of hope in the air. The community was fighting for legal recognition, and they were finally starting to win. But on the other hand, the scars of the past, they were still fresh, and danger was still a very real part of daily life. Even in 2001, despite the political milestones, homophobic harassment and hate crimes were still a dark, present reality. At the University of Toronto itself, reports from the era highlight the ongoing struggle against the conservative backlash and the urgent need to create safe spaces for the queer students. And like we said, the village, it was a sanctuary, but it was a sanctuary surrounded by a world that could still be incredibly hostile. David Buller navigated both of these realities with incredible grace. At 50 years old, he lived a life through the era of hiding. He had survived the devastating toll of the AIDS epidemic in the 80s and 90s, and he came out the other side entirely unapologetic about who he was. His art reflected his journey. His formal abstract paintings had transformed into deeply personal, vulnerable works that explored the male body, sexuality, and the gay experience. And we'll get a little deeper into this later. He brought his whole authentic self into the historic halls, often the rigid halls at the University of Toronto Fine Arts Department. For the young queer art students trying to find their footing in the world that was still debating their right to exist, David wasn't just a professor. He was proof that you could survive, thrive, and be respected without hiding in the shadows. He was living out loud until someone silenced him. But by the time winter of 2000 rolled into 2001, David Buller was an established, highly respected figure both in the Toronto arts community and within the walls of the University of Toronto. But who was he when he wasn't standing in front of a lecture hall? His social circle was exactly what you would expect for a 50-year-old lifelong artist. It was a rich tapestry of fellow painters, academics, and former students who had transitioned into friends. He was known for being warm, generous with his time, and deeply embedded in the creative pulse of the city. And when it came to his family, David was exceptionally close with his niece, Karen Sandlos. She was an academic herself, and she looked at her uncle not just as family, but as profound inspiration. They had a deep bond. In fact, the last time Karen saw David alive was just weeks before the murder. They had spent the Christmas holidays together at her mother's home in Collingwood, Ontario, and shared a long, quiet bus ride back to Toronto. It's a memory that would soon take a devastating weight for her. As for his romantic life, at the time of his death, David didn't have a publicly known long term partner. He was single, focusing heavily on his students and the brand new collection of artwork he was presenting for an exhibit. Because David was single and he was so dedicated to his craft, he spent a massive amount of time at his studio at One Spadina Crescent. If you're into historic architecture or urban exploration, this building is a masterpiece. It's a massive, looming Gothic revival structure built in 1875, standing right in the center of a roundabout. It has these sharp, impressive spires, arching windows, and long, echoing shadow hallways. It's a beautiful building, but in the dead of the freezing Toronto winter, it can also feel incredibly isolating. And that isolation is exactly what makes the events of Thursday, January 18th, so baffling. The police would later float multiple theories about his personal life, that it was a disgruntled colleague, a failing student, or even someone who he was casually dating that had walked into that Gothic building to confront him. His family, especially Karen, has always been highly skeptical of the casual date theory. It doesn't fit the man that she knew because someone knew exactly where to find him. Someone knew his routine, and someone knew exactly how to slip into the shadows of one Spadina Crescent and walk out a ghost. We've touched briefly on David's art, but to truly understand the man and the chilling atmosphere surrounding his death, we have to look closer at the canvases he left behind. Because for David, painting wasn't just a profession, it was the clearest insight into his mind. In his early career in the 70s, David's work was massive and formally challenging. He painted these huge, expansive abstract pieces that experimented wildly with space, color, and heavy applications of acrylics. But as he moved into the 1980s, completing his Masters of Fine Arts in 1985, his aesthetic underwent a striking evolution. The bold, distinct visual energy of the decade seemed to seep into his work. He began producing pieces with evocative titles like Center Stage and Scars and Stars. His style, it also began to change. It became incredibly layered. He started stepping outside the traditional boundaries of the canvas by working with photography and painting. It was ingeniously combined. Through this mixed media approach, his art became deeply, unapologetically personal. He would juxtapose homoerotic imagery like leather, denim, and the male form with recognizable icons from classical art history and contemporary pop culture. Years after the murder, true crime investigators and art analysts look back at David's final paintings, searching the canvases for clues of the state of his mind. What they found was deeply unnerving. In the latter half of his career, a distinct darkness began creeping into his work. It was a stark contrast between light and dark, where a deep, almost palpable fear seemed to eclipse the brighter world of his earlier paintings. Those final pieces invoked a sense of ominous menace. To some who studied them, it felt as though David was etching an apprehension of impending doom directly into the canvas. Did he know something was coming? Was that darkness just an artistic exploration, or was it the shadow of his killer? So we need to talk about where David spent most of his time, and that's one Spadina Crescent. Before it ever became the University of Toronto's Fine Art Department, it lived many different lives. It originally opened as a theological school called Knox College. Then during World War One, it was transformed into Spadina Military Hospital, treating the wounded soldiers returning from the front lines. And then a fun fact, Amelia Earhart actually worked there as a nurse's aide in 1918. By the 1940s, the building was taken over by medical research laboratories. It was a massive site for the production of insulin and penicillin. And by the time David Buller was working there in 2001, the building housed not only the Fine Arts Department, but also, bizarrely, the Eye Bank of Canada. It was a sprawling, echoingly, deeply atmospheric building that smelled of old oil paints, turpentine, and decades of history. In fact, years after David's murder, the building gained such a reputation that a young woman actually fell to her death while exploring the roof with a friend, supposedly looking for ghosts. This Gothic fortress was David's second home. He was hired by the University of Toronto in the mid 80s as a senior tutor and a lecturer in the visual studies department. He spent over 15 years walking those long, shadowy hallways. Inside the classroom, David was universally beloved. Art school can be an incredibly vulnerable experience, but David had a reputation for being an exceptionally generous mentor. He was warm, he was patient, and his queer students, he was a vital anchor for them. He fostered a studio environment where students felt safe to experiment and push boundaries. But university faculties are notorious for being a totally different world behind closed doors. Academia can be notoriously cutthroat, and the fine arts department was no exception. There was whispers of departmental friction, heavy academic politics, and the kind of intense professional jealousy that brews when a brilliant, opinionated artists are forced to share a department. While his students adored him, David was a senior figure in an environment where tension was always simmering just below the surface. Which brings us to January 2001. David was 50 years old and at the top of his game. He was heavily engrossed in a brand new, highly anticipated collection of artwork. Because of this, he was spending long, solitary hours locked inside his studio office. Thursday, January 18th, 2001, started out like any other winter day on the campus. It was freezing outside, so students and faculty were huddled inside the heavy stone walls, hurrying through the corridors to get to their studios and lectures. David was having a completely standard Thursday. He was in the building, preparing for an evening class he was scheduled to teach later that night. Sometime early that afternoon, a student spotted David stepping into an elevator, presumably heading up to his office. He gave no indication that anything was wrong. He didn't look nervous. He wasn't looking over his shoulder. He was just the professor going to work. That brief glimpse in the elevator is the last time anyone can definitely say they saw David alive. What happens next is the most frustrating and chilling part of the entire case. Once Spadina Crescent wasn't empty. It was the middle of the day during an academic semester. There were students in the studios, faculty in their offices, and staff walking the halls. In fact, on that specific afternoon, there was actually a function happening just in the room below David's office. Sometime during the afternoon, through the thick doors and walls and hallways, people near David's office heard something. They heard raised voices, an argument break out. The voices got louder, escalating quickly into a heated confrontation, and then a loud, heavy thud, a crash against the floor, and then silence. Tragically, no one called campus security. No one went over to knock on the door to see if everything was okay. In an art school, loud noises, clattering easels, and passionate arguments aren't exactly out of the ordinary. People assumed it was just typical departmental drama or maybe students moving heavy equipment. They brushed it off and went back to their day. Behind that closed door, David had just been stabbed 7 times in the chest, shoulder, and back. It was frenzied, incredibly violent. It was a close quarters attack. The killer was now standing in a bloody crime scene in the middle of a bustling university building in broad daylight. They had to get out, and somehow they did exactly that. The perpetrator managed to exit the office. They pulled the door shut behind them and walked out without a single person noticing anyone covered in blood, acting suspicious while they were fleeing the scene. They vanished into the freezing Toronto afternoon like a ghost. The hours ticked by, and evening fell over the campus. At 6 p.m., David's students began gathering outside the lecture hall for his scheduled class. David was famous for his punctuality and his dedication to his students. He never missed a lecture, but 6 p.m. came and went, then 6:15, then 6:30. A few concerned students actually walked to his office and knocked on the door. It was locked, and the lights were off. They assumed he had simply gone home sick, or there had been a massive scheduling error. Eventually, the students gave up and they left the building. That night of Thursday, January 18th, was bitterly cold in Toronto, and as the city slept, one Spadina Crescent sat in the darkness, its Gothic spires casting long shadows over the empty campus roundabout. Inside his locked office, David Buller lay dead, the vibrant, beloved artist who had spent decades painting life onto massive canvases had been reduced to a horrific, bloody crime scene. The sun didn't begin to rise over the city until almost 7:45 that time of year. So when Friday morning arrived, it was still pitch black outside. Just before 7 a.m., the building was silent. The students and faculty wouldn't start trickling in for another hour or two. The only person walking the labyrinth of hallways in the fine arts department was a custodian, arriving for her early morning shift. She began her routine, moving through the echoing corridors with her cart, keys jingling as she unlocked the faculty offices to empty the trash and clean the floors. At exactly 6:58 a.m., she reached David's door. She unlocked it and pushed it open. Stepping into the dark room, what she found inside was something no one should ever have to see. The office was a scene of absolute carnage. David was lying on the floor unresponsive. The brutality of the attack was immediately obvious. He had been stabbed repeatedly. Reports will later confirm it had been 7 times. The wounds were concentrated around his chest, and there was one on his back. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was a frenzied, deeply personal, close quarters attack. The custodian rushed out in a panic and immediately called the police. Within minutes, the quiet academic atmosphere of the university was shattered. First responders and officers from Toronto's Police Service Division 52 flooded the building. Emergency medical personnel rushed into the office, but it was far too late. David Buller was pronounced dead at the scene. A beloved professor had been slaughtered in broad daylight, and the killer had walked out like a ghost. For the detectives of the 52 Division, the nightmare of solving the unsolvable crime had just begun. When Toronto's police service arrived that Friday morning, they immediately locked down the building. Yellow police tape was strung across the historic Gothic archways. Students arriving for their morning classes were turned away, greeted by the flashing red and blue lights of squad cars. The investigation was officially handed over to the TVS Homicide Squad, designated as Homicide Number 4 of the year 2001. The detectives immediately began processing the scene, looking for the standard breadcrumbs the killer leaves behind after a frenzied close quarter stabbing. But almost immediately, they realized that this investigation was going to be a nightmare. First, there was the murder weapon. An autopsy would confirm that David died from multiple stab wounds to the torso. The blade used in the attack, it was nowhere to be found. The killer had taken it with him. Then there was the DNA. In a violent struggle with a knife, it's incredibly common for the attacker's hand to slip down, cutting themselves and leaving their own blood at the scene. But the forensic teams found absolutely no usable DNA that didn't belong to David. No foreign blood, no hair, no skin cells under his fingernails. And then there was the escape route. There was no bloody footprints leading down the hallway. There was no bloody handprints on a doorknob. Furthermore, there was no forced entry into the office. The door hadn't been kicked in, and the lock wasn't picked. This suggested one of two things. Either the door was unlocked because it was the middle of an academic day, or David had willingly opened the door and let the killer inside. And when the attacker left, they simply just pulled that heavy wooden door shut behind them, locking the secret inside. You might say, what about cameras? But in 2001, surveillance wasn't what it is today. While there might have been a few cameras on the campus perimeter, the interior of one Spadina Crescent was a blind spot. There was no video footage of anyone entering or leaving his office. The detectives were left with a locked room mystery. They had a brutal murder committed in broad daylight in a building full of people with an overheard argument, and yet the killer was a phantom. With zero physical evidence to go on, investigators had to rely entirely on old school detective work, canvassing and interviewing. Over the next few weeks and months, police interviewed hundreds of people. They spoke to his current and former students. They interviewed the fine arts department. They canvassed the gay village, looking for anyone who might have seen him with someone new, or heard a rumor, or noticed something strange. They were desperately searching for a motive because, in a case with no physical evidence, the motive is usually the only thing that points to the killer. When you have a crime scene with zero physical evidence, investigators have to rely on behavioral science. They have to look at the how and the where to figure out the who. And the how and where of David's murder creates one of the most baffling psychological profiles in Canadian true crime history. Let's break down the psychology of a killer who strikes in the middle of the day inside a populated building. In criminal profiling, offenders are generally categorized as organized or disorganized. A disorganized killer is impulsive. They strike in a frenzy, often leaving the murder weapon behind, leaving a messy crime scene and making mistakes. An organized killer is predatory. They stalk, they plan, they bring their own weapon, and they clean up their tracks. The Phantom of One Spadina Crescent sits right on the terrifying edge between those two profiles. On one hand, the attack itself was absolutely frenzied. Stabbing someone 7 times in the chest is what behavioral scientists call overkill. It requires a massive amount of physical exertion and almost always indicative of intense blind rage. It's a deeply personal way to kill someone. You have to look them in the eye, you have to feel their breath, and you have to be covered in their blood. Furthermore, attacking someone in a busy university building in broad daylight is incredibly high risk. It implies the killer was so consumed by their emotion or their objective that they completely disregarded the massive risk of getting caught. The overheard argument right before the murder tells us that it wasn't a silent assassination, it was a confrontation that boiled over into homicide. But on the other hand, the aftermath was chillingly organized. The killer brought a weapon and took it with him. They left no DNA. They managed to pull themselves together, shut the door, and navigate the twisting hallways of that building without drawing a single glance from anyone. This tells investigators two crucial things. First, the killer almost certainly knew David. And second, they were intimately familiar with the layout of one Spadina Crescent. They knew exactly how to get out. Based on these profiles, the Toronto police began chasing three primary theories. Based on this profile, the Toronto police began chasing three primary theories. Theory one is kind of combined of two. It's a disgruntled student or a colleague. Academia can be an absolute pressure cooker. Was it a student who was failing that blamed David, or perhaps the motive was professional? Arts departments are notoriously fierce rivalries, massive egos, and cut through jealousy over grants and expositions. Did a professional dispute escalate into a fatal confrontation behind closed doors? So there's this show. It's a Canadian show called To Catch a Killer. It's a little bit cheesy, but they really dove into like the theory of this disgruntled student. There was talk about this student before this happened. He was harassing different professors, and he was said to be at the back of the class with a knife. And David felt, his safety was in jeopardy. So that's part of that theory. And then also, there's a theory of like his colleagues. Apparently, there's a bunch of like political stuff that was like going on, and like names were never named like by the police for the student or the faculty. But like during this show and during other research, it said there was like two faculty members that were like singled out that um, were to be considered suspects, and most likely it was like one of the faculty members that did it because supposedly like the student was um, taken out of like the suspect pool because he was seen at a bank and he didn't have the time to come back from the bank to the school. Blah blah blah. It rolled him out. Anyways, so the show, like after all, like their like investigation and all that stuff, they came to the conclusion that it was highly likely that it was one of these two names. faculty members that were the people that killed him. So that was kind of where it was left, but none of it's substantiated. That's just the last known kind of like theory. It was a faculty member that killed him. So anyway, back to the main police theories. Theory number two, they theorized it was a targeted hate crime. David was an openly gay man, and his recent artwork boldly explored homoerotic themes and queer sexuality. And like we said, in 2001, the cultural climate was still highly volatile. Police had to consider whether David was targeted by someone who was perhaps radicalized, maybe a student or an outsider who wandered on campus who was deeply offended by his homosexual identity. And then finally, theory three, which is the one that like no one really believes. Theory three is the secret lover. Because of the sheer intimacy and violence of the overkill, detectives heavily pushed this theory that it was a crime of passion committed by a romantic partner. Police spent months canvassing the gay village looking for evidence of a secret relationship or a casual hookup that had gone wrong, or someone that David might have just rejected. And that's really typical, especially of like this era and before the police with any kind of like gay man that's like murdered or like gay crime. It's always the jilted lover angle. It's because he was gay. It was because he was living a promiscuous lifestyle. Blah blah blah. It's all like straight up bullshit. And this theory caused massive friction in David's family, especially his niece Karen. She felt the police were stereotyping, which they were, and assuming that because he was a gay man, his death must be tied to some shadowy, risky personal life, rather than looking for serious candidates like professional enemies that he might have made through the cut world fine arts department. Which, like, after everything I've like read and seen, I pretty much agree with that show that it's probably one of his like colleagues in the fine art department that did it. But that's just my opinion. It's only speculation. But despite years of chasing all three theories, they hit dead ends, dead end after dead end, and Toronto police could never pull a name out of the shadows. When a horrific crime happens in a public space, especially a bustling university, there's an immediate collective shock. In the days following David's murder, the University of Toronto campus was paralyzed. Students mourned the loss of a mentor who profoundly shaped their lives. Memorials were held, tears were shed, and for a brief moment, time stopped. But institutions are massive machines, and eventually the gears have to start turning again. The yellow police tape was taken down, and one Spadina Crescent reopened its doors. Students were back to their easels, the world moved on, but David's family and the detectives of the Toronto Police Cold Case Unit, they were trapped in 2001. Months turned into years, and a desperate bid to shake loose any hidden secrets, the Toronto Police Service offered a $50,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of David's killer. Billboards went up, flyers were handed out. Detectives hoped that the money combined with the shifting loyalties that naturally happen over time would finally compel someone to break their silence. But the phone, it never rang. The $50,000 still remains unclaimed today. Through all of these agonizing decades, the loudest and most persistent voice demanding justice has been David's niece, Karen. She refused to let her uncle become just another dusty file in the police archives. Karen has been a fierce advocate, frequently speaking to the media on the anniversaries of his death. She's also been incredibly vocal about her frustrations with every police investigation. For years, she's pushed back against the narrative that David was killed by a secret shadowy lover theory. She felt it was steeped in harmful stereotypes about gay men and distracted investigators from looking closer at the hyper competitive professional environment inside the university walls. She wanted them to look at his art. She wanted them to look at his colleagues. She wanted them to look at the reality of his daily life, not a caricature of it. The sheer impossibility of a locked room, broad daylight murder has kept David's story alive in the true crime sphere. Over the years, the case has been dissected by journalists, podcasters, and amateur sleuths. It gained significant national attention when it was featured on the Canadian investigative series To Catch a Killer. The show brought in experts to analyze the dark, ominous themes in David's final paintings, introducing the chilling theory that he may have been documenting his own impending doom right on the canvas. Yet, despite the television coverage, the reward money, and his family's unwavering dedication, the ghost of one Spadina Crescent has never been unmasked. Today, over 2 decades later, David Buller's murder remains one of Toronto's most baffling unsolved cold cases. A brilliant artist, a trailblazing gay man, and a beloved mentor, silenced in his own sanctuary. And somewhere out there, walking among us, is a killer who knows exactly how to get away with murder. So you might ask, where does the investigation stand today? As we move through 2026, the murder of David Buller remains an open, unsolved cold case in the hands of the Toronto Police Service. We have now hit the devastating 25-year mark since David was taken from his family and his students. And there's still no public suspects, no DNA breakthrough, and no arrest. In a recent interview reflecting on a quarter century without answers, David's niece, Karen, spoke about the agonizing wait. She admitted that in those first few days of 2001, she truly believed investigators would crack the case immediately. She never imagined that she would be sitting here 25 years later, begging the public for information. But she also made one thing incredibly clear: time does not diminish the truth. And as she put it, even though we're 25 years down the road, no piece of information is insignificant. Sometimes time clarifies things. The family worries that as decades pass, potential witnesses might move away, but they refuse to give up hope that someone, somewhere, is finally ready to unburden themselves of a 25-year-old secret. And that's where you come in, because cases like this don't get solved by staying in the dark. If you have any information regarding the murder of David Buller at 1 Spadina Crescent on January 18th, 2001, no matter how small or seemingly irrelevant you think it might be, you're urged to contact the Toronto Police Service at 416-808-7400, or you can leave anonymous tip through Crime Stoppers. Thank you so much for joining me as we pull back the curtain on one of Toronto's most baffling locker room mysteries. If you want to see the photos of the gothic 1 Spadina Crescent building or view some of David's incredible evocative artwork, head over to our social medias. I've linked in the show notes below. And if you're enjoying the show, please take a second to hit that follow or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening on now and leave a rating and quick review. It's the absolute best way to support the show and to help us keep the lights on, per se. Until next time, keep your doors locked. I'm Matt, and this has been Homicidal Tendency. Stay safe out there.